you want to be on camera, you can be on camera. And if you don't want to be on the like forever recording document, you're welcome to turn your cameras off. And let me just pull up my notes here. Great. Okay, so I'm going to introduce myself again. I'm Julia Pasciuto. Oh, I'm getting some feedback. Oh, Eunice. Eunice is here.
Next round, people.
We'll circle back to you, Eunice, for introduction. I'm Julia Pasciuto. I use she and her pronouns. I'm a strategic advisor with the City of Seattle, supporting our equitable transit-oriented development work and equitable development work more generally. And we have an amazing panel tonight of leaders from Minneapolis, Chicago, and Portland who are implementing equitable development strategies around transit or large capital investments. So our first panelist is Roberto Requejo, who is a systems change leader specialized in equitable neighborhood development, cross-sector initiatives, and community-driven capital investments. Since 2017, he has led the Elevated Chicago Coalition, overseeing $15 million in resources to advance equitable transit-oriented development. And, you know, these folks have really extensive bios. I will send them out to the full crew, but for the sake of time, I'm going to focus on kind of what the connection to our work is. We're also joined by Dr. Stephen Holt, who's born and raised in Portland, a graduate of Warner Pacific College with a master's level work at Western Seminary and honorary doctorate of philosophy and humanities from the United Graduate College and Seminary International. He is the chair of the Oversight Committee for the Northeast Portland Housing Strategy to assist the Mayor of Portland, Oregon's affordable housing agenda. He's developed a well-rounded board of community representatives who are committed to addressing gentrification and displacement. What started as a $20 million investment has grown to $100 million investment with over 1,500 affordable rental units and more than 130 homeowners resulting from that effort. We also have C. Terrence Anderson, who leads the Blue Line Anti-Displacement Initiative in Minneapolis. As the Director of Community-Based Research at the Center for Urban and Regional Affairs at the University of Minnesota, Minneapolis, St. Paul. Is that the full name? C. Terrence oversees CURA's community-based programs, including the Chris Nelson Community-Based Research Program, the Community Assistantship Program, and the Artist and Neighborhood Partnership Initiative. And I'm going to, we have a few questions and time for the community advisory group to ask you questions. These folks know a little bit about what your purpose and charge is, so I'm not going to go over that. But wanted to give you the floor. The format is I'll ask the questions and then we will pass it around the panel for responses. And Margot's keeping time, so we want to make sure to get you all out by 6 p.m. our time, 8 p.m. for the Central Time folks. So if you want to introduce yourselves and kind of your connection to equitable development or the kind of coalitions or organizations that you're working with, first I'll pass it to Roberto.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
We can.
Good. I never know in Teams, so I'm so glad that Teams is collaborating today. It's a pleasure to be here today, and thank you, Julia, for the invitation. Super excited to see cities like Seattle joining the movement for more equitable development near transit. Excited also how your transit authority is, changing also and kind of embracing some of those principles along with the city, which is something that we've been trying to do in Chicago now for at least 7 years, which is when we started my coalition, Elevated Chicago. We are a group of community-based organizations and institutional partners, including the City of Chicago, the Chicago Community Trust, which is our community foundation, a couple community development financial institutions or CDFIs. As many of you know, these are like community development oriented financial institutions that provide loans and other types of products to developers of affordable housing and community facilities, etc. And a couple of research and policy and advocacy organizations like the Metropolitan Planning Council and Center for Network Technology. But all that said, I would say the heart of our coalition and the drive of our coalition are the community-based partners. And these are organizers, social service organizations, small business service providers that are located near train stations in Chicago, and that 7 years ago told us, hey, we don't like what we're seeing near transit in Chicago. We had a great infrastructure network. We have the Chicago Transit Authority, 145 train stations, 10,000 bus stops, and yet when the city passed the first take or the first cut at an ordinance to promote transit-oriented development, what happened, and Julia can show you the map that we did, is that 90% of the transit-oriented development happened in a few neighborhoods in the north side of Chicago, which is mainly white, mainly wealthy, and displaced a ton of low-income families, especially Latino families in those communities. Thanks, that's the map. So when they first passed the ordinance, this is what our city looked like. And as you can see, there is the west and the south sides of Chicago, and that's our historically Latino and Black communities that saw very little or no development whatsoever. So our community partners came to the table and said, we are not against transit-oriented development, but we need to put an E first, and we need to lead with equity, and this cannot be the map of Chicago. So we worked together for 7 years. We worked, I'll tell you a little bit more later because this is just the intro now, but I wanted to show you also the map that shows what the footprint is today after those 7 years of work with community partners, with the city of Chicago, with funders and national partners. We are now proud to show a different map that shows 60 ETOD sites all across the city. Those areas that you see blank there are now small businesses, theater companies, affordable homes, walkability, improvements that are at different stages of development. So just want to stop here and say this is who we are, very action-oriented, lots of challenges too, and lots of like horror stories, but we are on a path now to change, the map driven by those community partners who showed us a better way to develop near transit.
Thank you. Dr. Holt, tell us about your work.
Well,
Introduce
good
your
evening,
work to
everybody.
us.
Excited to be a part of the panel. Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me?
We can.
I hope I'm not freezing. Am I freezing up? Okay.
Mm.
Excited to be part of the conversation tonight. I'll give you a quick high-level overview of the work that we're involved in. So there are two aspects of my involvement and engagement in this space. One is, as a volunteer, I oversee the Housing Committee, the North-Northeast Housing Strategies Committee, which is specifically designed to address gentrification and displacement. Portland was one of the #1 cities for gentrification and displacement. Over 10,000 families moved out of North and Northeast Portland because of pricing, predatory lending, and city action. And so a few years ago, about 10 now, it was addressed by the city, the mayor of the city wanting to, well, I shouldn't say it was altruistic. It was a group of community leaders that brought to the attention of the mayor that promises that had been made had not been kept. And so some money was allocated to address the issue. An oversight committee was developed. I've been the chair of that committee ever since, and we'll talk more about that work. Secondly, the company that I'm the principal of, Tri Excellence, is a consulting company, a management consulting company that specifically addresses and works with government agencies and businesses and some nonprofit work to help organizations show up equitably and responsibly with community and community actions. One of the projects that we are leading is a transportation project involving Interstate 5. It is the only place between Canada and Mexico, where Interstate 5 in a major city goes from 3 lanes to 2. And that's right at the Rose Quarter, right at the Rose Garden, right where the Blazers play. And so we are leading a process to help expand that portion of the freeway and to do it in a way that is responsible, that is thoughtful, that's engaging community, not causing further harm, et cetera, et cetera. It's about a $1.6 billion project that our company is leading. So from housing to transportation, that's the space that we operate in, and I'm excited to be part of the conversation tonight.
See, Terrence, to you. And I'm going to mix it up on the next question, so don't get too
All right.
comfortable.
That sounds good. Hi, everybody. I am C. Terrence Anderson, Director of Community-Based Research Programs at the Center for Urban and Regional Affairs, or CURA, out here in the warm state of Minneapolis. It's not true. It's still cold. But it's good to be with y'all. Love Seattle. Love everything that's going on there. Miss all the food for sure. So I was hoping I can come out there in person, but next time we'll talk about that, right? Our project, what's relevant to y'all? We have been expanding our light rail system quite a bit over the past several years. One of the new lines that is in development is the Blue Line extension, which will run through from downtown Minneapolis to our northwest suburbs. If y'all don't know Minneapolis, that's a predominantly Black and brown communities that are on the lower wealth spectrum here in comparison to other places around it. And the project actually been in development for maybe 30 years at this point, and it's actually kind of in its second iteration. With the second iteration, it'll be running right through the heart of North Minneapolis, which is a predominantly Black community, largely low wealth and largely experiencing gentrification and displacement even before this. So our project really begins with the question of how can we do transit projects without displacing people? Even more, how do people who live around these lines be the primary benefactors, not some future-seeking populations, but the folks who live there right now. So I think very similar to the work that sounds like you're doing, Roberto, in a lot of ways in Chicago. I think there's a lot. CURA is a public policy research center that's centered in organizing. We begin with a reparative justice framework. So we actually talk about reparative justice, which is more in the frame of reparations in comparison to equity. I think there's a lot of reasons for that shift, namely, being the city where we're still living in the trauma of the murder of George Floyd, and that's really just shifted the expectations that community has for its governments here. It's quite radicalized the population, and I think in some ways the governments as well too, to do and live and project a different body of work to produce a different level of outcomes. The Twin Cities is a very high achieving place, but it also has the highest disparities out of any metro between Black and brown and white folks and Indigenous folks and white folks than any other place in the country. So while there's sort of this Minnesota promise, we sort of live also knowing that there's this huge range of disparate outcomes here. So I think there's a lot to sort of talk about. We're a public policy research center. Of course, we can talk about the research that sort of dives into it. But at the end of the day, CURA, we sort of begin and end with an organizer's framework around this, which means ultimately that our work is about shifting power and shifting structures. So a lot of research went into that, of course, a lot of conversations go into that. But I think the work of the anti-displacement working group, which was sort of put together in 2021 to develop a list of recommendations, wasn't really about the ideas themselves, but it was about how do we change decision-making in this project? How do we change the way that agency and consent in communities show up in structural ways in federal transit projects, which is a big lift. There's a lot in there, but I think that's the thing to think about. Because I think what we would say in the Twin Cities is that I think we have the ideas, I think we have people, but we don't have the structures. And so a lot of our work is about not just having an advisory committee where folks who have been historically disinvested in, disenfranchised, to show up the table that disenfranchised and disinvested in them, but still not sort of have the power to say yes or no, but instead to sort of redesign and develop new structures and tables of power where those folks are the core decision makers. And I think there's some real ways that we achieve that in this project. Of course, some ways that we fell short, but I think there's a lot of hope for us going forward in the future. So looking forward to being in that conversation and very glad to be here. Thanks.
Thank you. And I'm just going to keep you talking to Terrence, because I think you're started to answer the next question, which is Could you tell us a little bit about your process or coalition and how you reached your core strategies and campaigns?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think so. Our work it didn't start with this project for us around anti-displacement. We have sort of a significant report, at least in our region, about gentrification and displacement that we released in 2017. Have done a series of studies around it. But with this particular project, we being able the opportunity where the first line essentially failed, the first alignment failed, and a second alignment came to be that put it more in the heart of neighborhoods, and I live in North Minneapolis, and in the community in North Minneapolis, they're sort of used to governments not having their interest in mind. We have a deep well of organizers and organizing that's happened in the Twin Cities. And again, people sort of had a different mindset coming out of the pandemic and coming out of the trauma of the murder of George Floyd. And governments, I think, were wanting to know how they can do things different. But so they came to CARE. We contracted with Hennepin County and our MPO, the Metropolitan Council, who sort of deliver and administer these transit projects to say, okay, what could a different process look like? And so what we continuously see is, at least in the Twin Cities, we have a lot of community advisory committees, a lot of just sort of sit on this committee that's subservient to X community committee that's made up of elected folks and, sort of high level government folks who actually have the decision-making power. But we sort of recognize that in a history in which people don't have agency and consent, our process really centered agency and consent for these folks. So it wasn't just developing another committee that was sort of speaking advice, but it was really meant to be sort of a power center of community voice and community vision. And I think that's kind of the most important thing at the beginning of any process like this, to sort of center those aspects of agency and consent. You can sort of maybe tell that I've come from a very philosophical background. I'm a transit planner as well too, so I kind of just love to unite those things together. But that agency and consent aspects and shifting power aspect of things, that structure building aspect of things is really the center of our work. And so the question that we asked ourselves in our project was, what would get government to be more transparent? What would make government more accountable? What would different decision making look like in the future? And so within the anti-displacement working group, of course, we had a lot of organizers coming from a variety of different organizations representing the full demographic of our corridor, but we also had particular government folks and very particular philanthropic folks as well there too. And the question was, what are the ideas? Our first meeting was like, okay, here's 65 ideas about what folks are doing around the country, from Portland to New York and beyond, around anti-displacement. All right, there's 65 things that we know that work. Let's not waste a bunch of time and pretend that those things don't exist or haven't been tried, even in our own region. The question is what are the real barriers to implementing all these things? So there's rent stabilization, there's tenant opportunity to purchase, there's right to organize, there's all these different things that sort of make up the construction of different structure. But that was really what we centered on. And so we really got to pushing governments in sort of an accountable community-centered space to be very, very honest about, okay, why won't you do a rent stabilization policy or rent control policy? Why won't you sort of use the public land that you already own and put that in community-centered control in a variety of different ways? And to the government's credits, they showed up very authentically to that process. And we left the process with 17 policies, programs to implement that for all of those actors feel is the right things to do. And so I think, again, our process was really about accountability and transparency and shifting power and structure. And so that's really what we thought about more than it was about the research, which I think oftentimes can be used to sort of slow down process or sort of sit people aside or not really do the work. And we're really sort of cognizant about making sure that wasn't the case. So I'm not sure if that totally answers your question, but I'm sure we can probably dive into it more as well too. So,
I
yeah.
think it gives us a lot of food for thought. And Seema, I appreciate you putting the question in the chat. We're gonna feel free to put your questions in the chat as they come up. I know it's hard for me to hold my questions till the end. We'll get to the questions at the end of our time together. I'm going to try and keep us on time so we have a lot of time for questions. Roberto, same question. Oh, your sound is not coming through. No, Teams is turned on you halfway through. Dr. Holt, we'll come to you. Tell us a little bit about your process and how you determined your core strategies.
Thank you very much, Roberto. That's why I didn't say anything about Teams. That's been my experience with them the entire time. We've got an Apple product. I use Apple products, and they just don't like each other at all. So I will talk about housing specifically, and give you a quick overview, a context, and then talk about our process. Quick overview is this: if you Google white utopia, Portland, Oregon comes up. Oregon was set up intentionally as a racist state. It was set up to be a utopia for white and white people. People of color, specifically blacks, were not welcomed in the state and or encouraged to live in the state. Secondly, if you look at lash laws, if you pull up something called a lash law, what you will find out is that it was legal to whip people of color twice a year if they stayed in the state. So hold that in the context. And until about 1930, it was again discouraged for people of color to live in the state. Fast forward to the war, Second World War, where Henry Kaiser is building ships, and there's this communication that goes out around the nation, encouraging people to come and to be in Portland and to work in the shipyard. Well, the city of Portland didn't want blacks living in the city. City of Vancouver, Washington, which is right across the bridge, didn't want blacks living in the city. And so they made, within a few month period, a brand new city called Vanport. So you could look up Vanport as well. 45,000 people lived in this space between Portland and Vancouver. It was decimated by flood in 1948, which then forced people into community, forced black people into the neighborhood, and the neighborhood was called Albina. And Albina became its own city for a while. It later became grafted into the city of Portland. So all of the people who look like me and others who were brown lived in North and Northeast Portland. And so at some point, North and Northeast Portland were determined as blight. Urban renewal comes in, and we know that urban renewal is often brown people removal, or Negro removal, as it's often called. Removal begins to happen, predatory lending begins to happen, people begin losing space, losing ground. Fast forward to 2013, where the city is now in the midst of renewing the Northeast neighborhood, and they're bringing businesses in to enhance the neighborhood. And a deal is made with a company, Trader Joe's grocery store, kind of natural food grocery store. Deal is made to bring them in to Northeast Portland with no costs for the property that's given, and there's an uproar of the community. Uproar of the community in relationship to the history of the city, promises that were made as housing was being removed, that housing would be replaced, opportunities for housing would be replaced. The building of Emmanuel Hospital, the building of I-5, the Interstate 5, all of these things decimated the neighborhood. 2004 to 13, there's this upheaval. The mayor backs up and says, you're right, we haven't done what we said we'd do. We're going to allocate $20 million to this effort. From that $20 million, it was directed to the Portland Housing Bureau to kind of lead this process to engage community around housing. So I'd like to say that it came to pass out of this heartbeat to address the concerns of the community and wanting to provide opportunities for rental and home ownership. And it was from this altruistic place. It was not. It was very much from an outcry, very much from crisis, very much from a community-led process, which often is the case. However, I will say one of the things that came about as a result of it is it was determined that in order to ensure promises made become promises kept, we need to do things differently. And so let's create an oversight committee. One of the suggestions that came out of the process. So the Portland Housing Bureau was given the charge. They hired a consultant. Had a series of meetings. I was asked to be part of those meetings, and forums were created, 5 forums held in various neighborhoods to get a feel for the priorities of the community. What does the community want? Out of those community meetings, there were 4 things that were identified. One is assistance to prevent displacement. 2, to create new home ownership opportunities. 3, to create new affordable rental opportunities. And 4, to do land banking. Let's purchase some land for future development. Once that process was finalized, I was asked to chair this oversight committee, which I've mentioned. We developed a group of people who then went into the process of helping to ensure that nonprofit partners had opportunities to participate and help to establish affordable housing processes. So we crafted a pathway for home ownership from 0% AMI to 120% AMI, area median income. So people who actually have no income are now homeowners. It's a profound process, as well as 0%, 30%, 60%, and 80% AMI affordable rental units. We're now reevaluating the 30, 60, 80% because with the continued separation of housing prices in the city of Portland and the decline of income for people of color, we need 40% and 50% area median income opportunities as well. The biggest thing that came out of all of this is the preference policy. And if you're not familiar with the preference policy is a policy that is associated with geography around displacement and gentrification. It is connected to and associated with an area, neighborhood, specific demographic or specific zip codes that offers preference to people who've been displaced from that area who want to return. There's a 0 to 6 point process. All you have to do is be able to demonstrate that you, your family, your guardian, your grandparent had a zip code within this space and you were given preference. If your family lost their housing due to city action, you were taken to the top of the list. And that means that you have the opportunity to take advantage of any of the home ownership possibilities and or rental possibilities that are afforded in the city of Portland. It is the only policy that has been upheld by HUD in the nation. New York tried a policy, was overturned. San Francisco tried a policy, was overturned. Portland's policy is now being replicated in Austin, Texas, in 2 other cities that slip my mind at the moment. We've been contacted even from international interests to talk about the preference policy. So we came about it from a series of forums. The community informed the process. We then helped to implement it. And the oversight committee initially met every month for the first 2 years and would bring together and hold accountable city officials, city leadership, nonprofit partners. So kind of a public-private relationship to evaluate and stay accountable. We now meet every other month and have continued to do so for a decade. And there are people who've aged off and others who've come on, but accountability and oversight for this work. And this is all done volunteer.
Thank you, Dr. Holt. Roberto, are you back on audio?
Testing.
Yes. Okay.
Good.
And we are a little bit beyond time, so we're gonna please respond to this question, but for the wins, we're gonna keep it to a brief, brief win. So Roberto,
Sure.
Tell us about your process.
I was starting to say before teams turned on me that what Terrence was mentioning, it was resonating a lot with how we organize our work. Because when we went to the 7 train stations and met with those 7 community residents. They had a ton of things to say and a ton of both positive things they wanted to happen in their community and a lot of horror stories about what had happened to them on 20, 30, 40, 50 years of disinvestment in some cases, which was triggering displacement because people were leaving the community lacking all sorts of basic infrastructure, grocery stores, etc. Or the other side of displacement, which is the one that both my colleagues here from Portland, Minneapolis are talking about, which is the displacement triggered by cost going up and rents going up and taxes going up. So those two issues were very present in all these communities. And when we collected all of that, what we realized is that to have a proper equitable development plan around transit, we had to work in 3 main buckets at the same time. And it had to be at least a 10-year horizon. And so we made the funders, the city, aware that that was not going to be a 2-year or a 3-year or 5-year. This is a long horizon, or at least a decade of work, because the problems are also rooted in decades of issues. So the 3 buckets are people, place, and process, right? I start with place because place is the most tangible, and what we did with that piece of our agenda is to invest grants, capital in specific ETODs, developments near transit, led by community. So we made, I think, $3-4 million in grants to community centers, to affordable housing, to theaters. And also we invested in the areas around the station too, because it doesn't make sense to have a beautiful affordable housing development if people don't feel safe waiting for the bus or going to the train station. So we brought art, safety improvements, walkability improvements, and climate change also was a piece of this because our stations also get flooded, get really hot in the summer, and get polluted too by the smoke. And so we had also interventions like that. So place was very important, but place without people and process was not going to do it. So the people investment was also a ton of grants that we made to what we call community tables. And these are groups of neighbors that meet regularly, this type of committees that you were talking about, but they are led by themselves. They don't represent other interests than the interest in that community, right? And we supported organizers, we supported convenings of neighbors, we supported action too, and marches and protests and things like that. So to marry people and place. And then what we had to work on too is on process, which is the third piece of the puzzle. And that's our systems change agenda, right? So using the power of people organizing, using the power of bricks and mortar, symbolizing and showing that this is possible, we went and changed the ordinance that I showed you before. So our new ETOD ordinance is radically different. And it has an E first. We did a policy plan first with 80 plus organizations at the table, then passed the ordinance. And when all of that was in place, we were able then to convince the city to invest $1 billion for the first time in the history of Chicago in equitable transit-oriented development. So it's an arc of 7 years, 3 mayoral administrations, a pandemic in the middle, and throughout all this, it was the constant support and the constant accountability to those neighborhoods, to those community tables that kept the movement moving forward, and we were able to sustain and get to a place now where our next step now is how do we make sure that those 60 sites actually get developed, right? Some of them already broke ground, some of them are in planning stages. So we want to make sure the new administration, our new mayor, progressive administration, but also very challenged by the current political situation in Chicago, continue supporting and make sure that we turn the map again from what it was to what we want it to be.
Thank you. Okay, Dr. Holt, I'm starting with you. Maybe just a 1 sentence, 1 to 2 sentences of what is one thing that you're celebrating today?
We're celebrating 130 homeowners, from 0 to 130 homeowners, 85% whom are Black families who never would have been able to own a home, who now are owning homes as a result of this process. And we're also celebrating I think 1,500 families housed in affordable rentals and new communities that have been developed. So same kind of dynamic, shift over leadership changes within the city, et cetera, et cetera. But those are the things we're celebrating.
Amazing. See, Terrence.
Yeah, I mean, 17 unanimously supported policies for anti-displacement shared amongst community government and philanthropy that hopefully translates into $250 million to start building out that agenda after this legislative session. So feeling good about that.
And Roberto.
We literally celebrated a couple weeks ago the very first ETOD party in Chicago. We brought together 120 plus developers, community activists, and City of Chicago officials, electeds, people like you, Julia, who are doing a lot of work behind the scenes and never get recognized and never get to celebrate. We brought them together and we had all these developments I mentioned, the 60 developments in panels around the room for people to celebrate together that we may be a divided city and we may be segregated, but we can come together and we can see each other in the challenge that we have all across Chicago, right? And so that celebration, super inspiring. And we're using it also to put some pressure, honestly, on the city too, who came, Deputy Mayor came and spoke, saw and realized, wow, we have an accountability issue now. We need to make sure that all of these developments from the little corner store next to the train station to the mega, affordable housing development next to a bus stop actually materialized and are contributing to retain residents instead of displacing them.
That's amazing. And I feel like I love how the three of you are all celebrating. It's like a people, a process, and like an investment, right? It's like we have to celebrate all along the way, not just when we reach like our achievements at the end. And I think it helps me feel like there's going to be a lot for us to celebrate in our process as well. All right, last question is, what advice would you have for us as we are kicking off on this process? And again, I think we have about 10 minutes total for that. So just making sure that we save some time for questions. Dr. Holt, we'll start with you again.
Thank you. My advice is, I think, threefold. One is,
oh no. Is Dr. Holt freezing for you?
Yes.
Did I freeze?
Oh. Yeah, you're back.
I'm back. Okay. Involve elected officials. Involve decision makers that have voice, influence, that can move policy. Create accountability measures in the election, in that involvement. Get the buy-in early. If change is going to happen, leadership has to own it. Leadership has to be a part of it. So involve them. Two, thorough community engagement. A lot of community engagement to get the voices of the people involved in the process, so that there's this collaborative buy-in that happens in the process. And then thirdly, keep it marketed, advertised, talked about, take advantage of all the social media to leverage capital to tell the story. This is important work. It's significant work, and people need to know what's happening, and you can't talk about it too much. So elected leaders, community engagement, tell the story.
Roberto.
So I don't know that I know you all so well as to give you advice, but I would give me advice if I go back in time to 2017, and I would tell me first to probably to invest in champions and have. We talk a lot about changing the narrative, which is important, but we also need to change the narrators too. And the narrators need to be the people who live in community, take the train, use the bus, know what walkability means, rely on a bike to go to places, and they have the best stories. And then those champions, we need to also find them in different sectors, right? So you want to have the story being told, yes, by the community organizer and by the public housing resident, but I want to hear from Julia too, because our
city staff and leaders are community residents too. And they have stories too that you are told not to share because you have to show up professional and all those things, right? But some of your colleagues are going through the very same experiences, stresses that our community residents have. And it's really important that people see themselves in yourselves, in our public servants. And then same thing to find those champions in unexpected areas, right? People don't expect an artist to be all about equitable transit-oriented development. We have several artists, poets, painters that come to our table and present, their story from their artistic point of view, and people are like, wow, okay, that resonates with me, because they're speaking in Spanish, for instance, or they are painting a mural that represents that community. So finding those champions also in unexpected places and building on that to move forward. So you have your artists and you have your planners and you have your community residents and you have your funders too, right? Your funders need to be out there, your foundations too, in their forum saying, I believe in ETOD and this is why. And this is why our investments as a foundation return, all these benefits. So I would say investment in champions and as Dr. Hall was saying, in the narrative and the storytellers that are going to be sharing with the rest of the world why you have to spend time and resources in this type of development.
All right, close us out, see Terrence.
I love it. I also love the green aura from Dr. Holt right now, and it's amazing. And yeah, lifting up what Roberto is saying as well too about narrative. I think as concisely as I can say it, I think Kira and our community is largely starting to reject the sort of the feedback, the community feedback and the community engagement paradigms that kind of tend to persist or maybe even growing in government. Because I think I would say it like this. Let's just, I don't know, Alberta, are you there? Can you hear me, Alberta? Yeah. So I just want to imagine, like, I'm just gonna ask you like a simple question. Like, if I hurt you as an individual, who gets to decide what healing looks like for you? All right. I've never, ever asked that question and anybody has ever answered that any differently. And I think we can understand that on an interpersonal level, like the person who does the harm doesn't get to decide what the healing looks like. Yet we sort of pervade in these projects that where the governments who have done this historical wrongdoing get to decide when the projects happen. They get to decide how those projects and when to get feedback. At best, you'll get their advice. But then they sort of continue just to own the decision making. And then they wonder why at the end of it, community doesn't see its healing in that. And I think it's really at that basic level, the people who are harmed, the people who are burdened, the people who are at the end, of this American project need to be front and center of deciding the solutions, their own healing, not just as something that's nice to do, but as a very, very basic facet of justice in the first place. And so it's really thinking about that structure by which we even have ownership over the ideas that ownership over the issues that really affect us in our community that we really need to think about. So, it's almost like I see some of the questions like, well, how do you make sure government is responsive to your feedback? My question is, how does the structure say it has no other choice? Like the structure has no other choice other than accountability, no other choice but to follow community vision. And that's the sort of thing that we think about. And I can sort of break that down in a lot of different ways. Like, let me come out to Seattle, let's talk about it, like let's get lunch or whatever, right? It's gonna be super dope. But the second thing is thinking about like, what are we even trying to do here in the first place? And I'll just say, is it Kasima? Is the right thing? I'll just sort of like, you have a car? You have a car that you love? You have a car? Okay. Who has a car? I don't know. Bree, do you have a car? Okay, Bree, you have a car. Let's just imagine I took your car, I lit it on fire, and I kicked it into the Mississippi River. Like, you will never see this car again. You'd probably be pretty upset with me if I did that, right? Well, I'm an ethicist, so I come back a year later. I'm like, Bree, I want to make this right. Here's a new pair of shoes. Are we good? No, like they're really dope. They're Grail Jordans. They're like, it's what's up. Like, no, like, what do you need?
I'd love my car.
Another car. Maybe a really good transit system if we're thinking like in the future, right? I just take that really simple example about, like, we can't do cars for a shoe, right? We can't do shoes for a car, but yet we sort of talk about like, okay, what is equity in our system? It's Section 8 housing. And I'm not saying Section 8 housing is bad, like let's build more of it, but it's not equal in response to the harm of people who lost wealth, that lost choice about where they can live. And so like, what are we talking about today? And anti-displacement needs to be responsive and full to that history that contextualizes that problem that we're talking about today. And I think that's under what Roberto and Dr. Holt are talking about as well too. So we really sort of set the stage in our project about, you know, consent and agency and power, right? And I think that's a more important question than like, how do we engage community well? And it's not just about doing something that feels good right now. I mean, I believe in incremental process and these things will take decades to sort of recall, but what's our goal in the first place? And I think if we come into project with those mindsets, I think we get really, really different ways of doing things. We get really different outcomes. I think that's been true for us here in the Twin Cities. And I think, yeah, I don't know y'all as well enough to give y'all advice, but those are the things that I think about going into these projects.
Well, let's give our panel a virtual round of applause. I know it doesn't have the same impact as when we're together, but thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and I think giving us a platform to launch this process from and like a chart, like something to aspire to as well, because I think we have a steep hill to climb, especially with us as government convening this process, right? Like we have it's a heavy lift for all of us who are here, and I think the staff who are part of this process see ourselves also as participants here. So we have a lot of great questions in the chat. We can roll through a few of them, and then as you know, people are now things are you know, you're able to process what you all have just heard. Feel free to come off mute as well. I think the first question is, when multiple layers of governance are involved, and especially around election season, how do you convince the committee of electeds or the, you know, elected leaders who hold power to relinquish some of that power? And maybe how have you, like, what tactics have you found to be successful?
Yeah. I mean, I think you've got a power map for one. I mean, you've got to know who's making the decision. You got to know what their self-interest is. I think if you don't know that clearly, it's going to be really, really hard. But the other thing is, you know, of course, it's not just this project, it's about everything that happens outside, like almost thinking about it as an inside-outside strategy from an organizing framework as well, too. And, you know, I think this community has been organizing around this project for a decade. So our work lives in sort of a mirror of that, or sort of in reflection of everything that happened around that. But at the end of the day, it's again, digging into the structure about what's possible, knowing what the self-interest is, and having really, really transparent conversations. I find that most governments are full of Julias than there is the other way around. But most of those folks have been disempowered in order to sort of to live out things that they really agree with you about, right? And so I think if you can sort of dig and hold on and sort of trust long enough with each other, you'll sort of find that there's mutual self-interest oftentimes between governments and communities, but structures, of course, pervade, and we sort of get the dehumanization from that. So I think for us, we can, we have a very specific case to like what worked here. I think you really need to power map in Seattle to know really what it's like there. But it is like looking into the purse of money. And transit projects, it's knowing that, you know, environmental impact statements and everything that transit projects are trying to do is trying not to get sued. Like the whole process is built around not getting sued at the end of the day so that the project can be built at the lowest possible cost. Well, if community is united and has one voice about what it wants, that's probably what it's going to get. There's very little times, I think, when that happens. So organizing community to communicate very clear to government, I think, is the first thing. And knowing those levers of power that, you know what, well, you might get sued if you don't listen to us. That probably gets their attention more than anything else. But you probably find that there's self-interest there, I think, if you can have that open and transparent conversation. So we'd love to dive in more after sort of a power mapping or to do a power mapping, but those are some good tenets that I think about.
Let me jump in real quickly. I appreciate that. Thank you so much. I'm just specifically what we did in Portland. We created a charter. And so the oversight committee has a charter, and within the charter, there are two aspects. One is there's a reporting out to city council. So we see city council at least annually. And with the leadership structure in the city of Portland, a commissioner is assigned oversight to housing. And so I meet on a monthly basis with the housing commissioner. And then, as I mentioned earlier, we have this ongoing, accountable, open meeting that brings in community and brings in the public. So it keeps it current, and it causes an authentic accountability within elected seats and decision makers around this work. So if there's a way to craft that and bake that into your work, I would encourage it. Make it policy and not people driven, because people change. And so let's use policies that have been so historically used against us. Let's use them for us. Use the same process that's in place, make it policy, and establish it that way.
I'll just add that in Chicago, we have 50 council members. So we had to convince 36 of them to get the ordinance passed. And we did the power mapping, of course. But we realized also is that, yes, there are folks who don't want to relinquish the power, and there are folks who don't want to see equitable development happen. And we had to like separate them from the good people. But there was a lot of folks who actually needed our cover, and they were like dying to give us the power so we could be the ones saying the things that they didn't quite have all the support in their community to say. And some of the best aldermen that we have, and some of the people who did the most work for equitable development, were the ones who sat down with us and said, hey, listen, I love what you're trying to do here, but I have these wealthy people in my community that I need the votes for, and I need help from you all being the ones pushing me. I cannot be the one saying this in those words. And that frank conversation allowed us to do some maneuvering and some work behind the scenes and in front of the scenes, good cop, bad cop kind of dynamic that allowed us to rally the 36 that came in support of the ordinance, because when you have a group of them pushing, then others start to kind of join. But we had to look for who are the ones that are actually looking for that relinquishing of power in this particular case to get the cover, and who are these honest brokers and good aldermen who want to change things but just have the NIMBYs right on their necks, and they need us, to kind of show for the rest of the community.
I'm gonna have one more question from the chat before we open it up. What did you feel like was a turning point for your efforts in gaining serious momentum and acceptance?
For us was the moment that our departments of housing and planning and development, after being super defensive, non-cooperative, changing, new commissioner, finally came and said, okay, we're in, we need to do this. It was not until those commissioners, who then became the real heroes of everything that's moved forward in Chicago, until those commissioners said, okay, I'm in. The same way that I'm happy to talk about all the fantastic Julias I've met, we also found your evil twins, Julia, in those departments who are undermining every effort to keep the status quo, to keep doing the bare minimum. People who don't experience, they have zero experience of what poverty looks like, displacement looks like. And unfortunately, we have a ton of them. So we had to kind of reach out to the top. These new commissioners came from our coalition, some of them. And once they were in place, they were able to tell their deputies and their, long-term bureaucrats, hey, either you are in or you're moving out of the way, because we cannot have you being the obstacle here. So I'll be honest, it wasn't until that leadership from the departments, from planning and housing, that we started to see progress.
And I'll jump in and say that there have been multiple turning points along the way, but I would say the key was the launching point. It was when people were willing to roll up their sleeves and get involved in the lift. Sometimes the reality of change is if you measure change in the middle of it, it looks like a mess. It looks like failure. You don't know all that you're accomplishing until sometimes after the work is done, you get a chance to look back. And so the launching point was so significant. People with passion, people with commitment, people with persistence, because you have to be willing to carry thick skin and a soft heart so that you don't lose the passion while you're dealing with all the resistance, all the red tape, everything Roberto said. There are those who are going to hold on to power and not want to share it. There are those who are going to resist change because that's just what we do. There are people, even of your own camp, that are going to turn. If you maintain the focus and maintain the course, then at some point you get a chance to celebrate those pieces. I would add one more piece, and that is celebrate along the way. The fact that the conversation is happening, that's a big deal. Even before you see the work, celebrate the fact the conversation is happening. Oh, and I will add, I'm right down the street. I'm just right over the hill. You know, my wife loves Seattle, so we can just roll up and have conversation.
I think they both gave great answers, so we can always get to more questions too. I know we don't have too much time too, so it's either way.
All right, there's a couple people who are active in the chat, but would love to have anybody who hasn't put a question in the chat. If you have a burning question for this amazing panel, we'd love to hear from you as well. And I will fill the silence by saying, you don't know if I'm the evil twin or not. Anybody from the advisory group have a question? Let me go back into the chat and see. There's some very detailed questions about the specific recommendations, and I think we'll get into those as we start to explore the different strategies. There's a question about, despite your outreach efforts, do you feel like there were still communities that were unheard? Anything that you would have done differently or in addition to what was done?
Yeah, I mean, I feel this all the time, knowing that a lot of this work is extremely complicated, and we do a very poor job of getting complicated information that raises the capacity of people to get into higher and higher levels of conversation in this. And so, I feel even just within my neighbors still not feeling like they understand what's going on. So I think we need to think about engaging, or I just rejected engagement, but we need to talk about engaging folks and building capacity and growing the coalition of folks who are part of this conversation all the time, not just when we have projects. And I think that's work that we've been trying to, I think as a research center that we spend a lot of time on. And I think that governments need to take on a broader role. I think they're really yeah, we need to engage right now because we're doing something, but it's what happens in between? Are you building organizations' capacity who reach folks in the way that they need to be reached? All these different ways of leadership development, coalition building. I think we can really get into the sort of the life cycle of organizing. So yeah, I think we're missing folks all the time, and it keeps me up at night, to be honest. And but I think the work is ongoing in those variety of different ways that I talked about.
Yes, we missed people because there's no one way to reach people. And the work of we're competing with so many things: Instagram, Facebook, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, X, television, you name it. That's a real competitive issue in terms of getting people's attention. And so the answer that we've taken, or the approach we've taken, is just to keep telling the story in as many outlets as possible, and encouraging methods and methodologies that have historically not been used. But the only way is to continue to create opportunities to communicate. The word I use around engagement is connection. relationship connection and relationship establishment. So unfortunately, you miss even with your best effort.
Roberto, did you have anything to add here?
No, I want to allow for
Okay.
time to be used
Okay.
for other questions, because these are great answers.
Okay. There's one last question, which I think, we will definitely get to as we get into more of the detail. How can we assure that our efforts towards equitable transit-oriented development adequately address the needs of middle-income families who fall between the cracks of assistance programs, who may not qualify for things but are also struggling to afford housing? Are there ways that you've been able to incorporate middle-income families in your plans for equitable development?
Let
Yeah,
me
I
jump in real quickly, if I can. The economic development branch of Portland, Prosper Portland, we went specifically to them, and they engaged and were willing to commit millions of dollars to those who are the 80 to 120% AMI space because of that very reality. We prioritized it as a need and then have put strategies in place around it. Now, is it holistic and doesn't meet all of the need? No, but we're continuing to prioritize that response.
Yeah, and I wanted to just elevate what C. Terrence was mentioning before when you were talking about Section 8, right, as the default solution in some cases. Is like we have done a really great job in America to segregate issues that affect everyone and make them only of a few people, right? And when you look at public housing or you talk about public transportation, is often for just one collective of people, and a lot of folks don't feel it's about themselves, right? And so we have then situations where we have these programs that are divided and segregated in a way that a middle-income family don't see themselves, don't see their benefit on that anymore, right? And I think it's on us to make these departments of housing aware that this is not just for low-income families. This is not just for that segment of the population. You are further segregating and further alienating and separating our community when you present housing departments and housing programs as housing just for the very, very poor, right? And part of the resistance that we have right now in Chicago in particular is because whenever you hear public housing or affordable housing, a lot of folks who need affordable housing because they're not able to meet those criteria don't feel that that's for themselves, right? So we do have some programs also that go above and beyond the limits. They are not sufficient. They are framed also from a lens of scarcity and a lens of poverty, which shouldn't be, what housing is about, what transportation is about. Public transportation shouldn't be just for the very poor who have no other option either, right? But that's not how we frame it. That's not how we create a narrative around it. So in addition to the technical solutions, like creating programs that expand the bandwidth of these income levels, we need to do a different narrative around housing is for everyone, and public transportation is for everyone, and you middle class, you better care about people who are poorer than you because they are sustaining you too, right? And you have needs too, and you're on the same boat, right? We don't do that properly, and I think part of the problem is that the programs that the federal government funds, for instance, they are framed and they are siloed into these categories that make a lot of folks who are barely making it and yet don't meet the requirements to feel, oh, that's not for me, that's for them, right? So to me, it's both a narrative issue and a framing as well as a technical issue.
Thank you so much to panel. We're at time and I want to make sure everyone can get out of here. To the community advisory group, I know we kind of jumped straight into learning and about other examples of this work from across the country. This is our very first meeting for the panelists who are here. But just know that this isn't not every session is going to be like this. We are going to spend a lot of time getting to know each other, building relationship with our facilitators, and really start on the ground level together, and figure out what's going to work best for Seattle. So again, thank you so much to our panelists. Thank you to the facilitators, future facilitators who are here. Thank you to the advisory group members who are here, and the city staff and our director who are here as well. So have a great evening, and I'm sure we will be in touch to ask you many more questions as we start getting into the work.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great night.
Take care.
you.